Welcome, welcome. Hello, everyone. Lots of folks are kind of pouring in through the waiting room, so we'll give everybody a chance to get settled. Take a deep breath, like you're sitting in a seat, coming into an auditorium, about to hear a talk. Just take a moment, and we will get started in just a second. Thank you all for making the time today and joining us. We're thrilled so many people registered for this, and so many of the participants are now piling in here. My name is Stuart Q. I'm the Executive Director of the Yale Center for Business and the Environment, which is a joint initiative between the Yale School of Management and the Yale School of the Environment. What you're attending today is a series of authors talks that we've been hosting over the course of the past few months. This one, I'll introduce the author and the moderator for today's discussion. This one features a book that The Nature Fix, author Florence Williams. You can see my well-worn copy here, and we'll talk about kind of why this one is special to the folks at the Yale Center for Business and the Environment, and also we'll come back and tell you where you can get a copy of this. This book was released a number of years ago, and it's something that when we picked it up through the center, a number of us grabbed a copy, read it, devoured it, and then passed it along to somebody else. And I think it spoke to a number of things that a lot of us really believe in and feel deeply, and then we're so incredibly compelled and inspired that someone had captured so many of the elements of it. And it really was like a little bit of kind of, you got to sort of think about every favorite poet in your life that you've ever read that was writing about nature. And like, if they had access to neuroscience, like they would have loved this book. And, a lot of us in the center have young kids or other folks in our family who love getting outside, and like, this book gives you the real reasons and sense of the 6-year-old test. And I just did this yesterday with my 6-year-old. We went outside, he's on vacation. We walked around for an hour and a half in the woods, and he held out his arms, and he's quite engaged and enthusiastic, and he put him out and he screamed, "I love nature." And that was just like what an hour and a half did for this little munchkin. And one of the faculty directors at the center, Brad Gentry, has been somebody who long has deeply cared about this and kind of thought about this work and was incredibly kind of proactive in making sure that issues around health and nature were prominent in and around the university, and that everybody could get a copy of this book or get connected to it. So we're thrilled to have Florence here today. On a personal note, when I got a copy of the book, and you can see it's kind of well worn, and then there's lots of different markings in it of where it's been written on, passed it along to my wife, who loved it, and she works as a practitioner in a community clinic in New Haven, and she began working on prescribing health and nature with a coalition of people in and around the area. So how do you actually bake this into medical practice? So this is just a real joy for us to have. And the moderator for this is also a joy that we get to connect with Vincent Stanley, who's the director of philosophy at Patagonia, a co-author of a book, The Responsible Company, which was a real inspiration for a lot of us around here about Patagonia's journey. And a resident fellow at the Yale Center for Business and the Environment. And I think that like students would say, a dose of Vincent makes them happier, healthier, and more creative. So we feel like it's like a very nice connection between Florence and Vincent in that. But my colleague, Heather Fitzgerald, is going to drop into the chat where you can find a copy of this book. You cannot have mine. It's not on a used market. I'm keeping it. But you can find your own. And we are just very excited for today's talk, and really thank Vincent and Florence for making the time.
All right. Thanks, Stuart. I would just add from, it was a pleasure to read the book. I hadn't seen it when it first came out. I've been looking at it looking over it and reading in it and processing it for the past week. And I think it raises so many of the important questions of our relationship to nature, the necessity, the essential necessity of nature for human beings in whatever form it actually takes. And I'd like to talk about that. But also, just for those of you who don't know Florence and her background, just a couple of notes. She's the contributing editor to Outside Magazine, writes also for National Geographic, has written for New York Times, the New York Times Sunday Magazine, Slate, Mother Jones, and High Country News, which is a wonderful kind of underappreciated publication on which she also serves on the board. She's also a fellow at the Center for Humans and Nature, a visiting scholar at George Washington University, and author of a previous book called Breasts, A Natural and Unnatural History, and lives in Washington, D.C., and has an ambivalent relationship to it, as we see in the book. So I wanted to just start off, and also with thanks to Stuart and Heather for putting the work into this series and for getting it going, and thanks to you, Florence, for being here. I wanted to ask, first of all, what prompted the book? What inspired you to write it?
Yeah, thanks for asking that, Vincent, and thank you so much for inviting me to this series. I'm a graduate of Yale, and I've always been a fan of kind of the synergy between SOM and the forestry school, or what used to be called the forestry school. I took many classes there as an undergrad too. Yeah, you know, I actually grew up on the East Coast. I grew up in New York City, was fortunate enough to be in Tom Sycama's classes studying ecology and running around outside. My first job was working for High Country News in Western Colorado, and I never went back east. So I stayed in the Rocky Mountains for 2 decades. And then my family moved back to Washington, D.C. And I just noticed personally that this kind of stress bomb went off in my own brain. I was not used to the noise pollution and all the asphalt and the crowds. And I started to really think about what I was missing by not kind of being so close to the mountains and having my, kind of almost daily connection to what I considered, nature. And I had a very, sort of snobby definition of nature. I was very spoiled to have that Rocky Mountain, sort of access all the time. And so I started to really think about that. And, I had heard this term nature deficit disorder from the journalist Richard Louv. I wondered if that's what I was experiencing. Was I having this kind of withdrawal from nature? And is that what was affecting my nervous system and my brain and my mental health? And so I wanted to just find out what the science had to say about it. What was the state of the science? And so I was fortunate to get an assignment from Outside Magazine and then from National Geographic. The two of those really sent me around the world to talk to different scientists, kind of doing very current research, some of which I did on myself. The way I tell stories is kind of first person, sometimes using my own body and brain as sort of a proxy. Not that that is science, but it's sort of a way to talk about the science. And I just thought, wow, there's a lot going on here. And some unexpected things. And I just thought this could be a book.
All right, thanks. Yeah, I think it's one of the beauties of the book that it connects you get a really strong sense of the people that you meet along the way, including yourself, because you do hook up the wires to yourself, and you do talk about your own experience. And also a sense of place that gets connected to the findings of the neuroscientists. One of the things one of the things I'm curious about, I know from our experience at Patagonia, we started out as a mountain climbing equipment company, and then we got into outdoor clothing, and we felt that we owed something back, so we started giving 1% of sales to small grassroots environmental groups in the 1980s who were usually working passionately on some stretch of land or or water that they wanted to defend. But it really was an evolution for us to discover over time that nature was much deeper than the places we love to play in or love to go, that it was that the health of nature underpins everything. And I think that one of the things I got from reading your book was the varying sense of nature. That, you know, you went to Japan and Korea where people have a really ferocious attachment to the idea of nature and the essential qualities of nature, but very little of it that isn't really populated. So it's a long way to ask a question, but did your idea of what nature is change in the course of writing the book, or what is it, or more specifically, what is it to you now? What is it that's so essential to us? Because we know that there is no nature that has not been affected and is not being affected by human use.
That's right. Yeah, those are really thoughtful questions. You know, I think like many of us, you know, we grew up sort of assuming that we're not really nature, that we are different from nature and that we sort of exist outside of it. And as you say, you know, so maybe we play in it or recreate in it and have this almost personal sort of extractive conception, you know, of what we can get out of nature. I think it was really interesting to spend some time in Japan and South Korea, where the concept of nature is really more holistic, and it's part of how you engage in your daily life. It's sort of the plants that you bring into your home, the greenery that you bring into your home. It's the, you know, the tiny garden in the neighborhood where you can hear some birds. During the course of the book, I did start thinking about other definitions of nature, and I really liked Oscar Wilde's definition, which is nature is a place where birds fly around uncooked. Wow, that is a good way to look at it. And then, of course, I live in the heart of Washington, D.C., and I thought, you know, I really have to figure this out. I have to learn how to sort of access nearby nature and develop a relationship with that if I'm going to stay sane. And so for me, I like it. There have been these national surveys that ask little kids, you know, what is nature? What is nature? Mm-hmm. And the little kids will say things like, oh, it's the caterpillar, you know, on my sidewalk. Mm-hmm. Or, you know, it's the squirrel, you know, just right over there. Yeah. And if you ask adults, a lot of them will say, well, it's Yosemite, you know, it's a national park. And I think for me, it was great to kind of embrace that childhood definition a little more. And I think a lot of us now, maybe during this year, we've all come to appreciate that nearby nature, and many of us have developed, I think, more of a relationship with it. It's one of the questions I'm looking forward to maybe hearing about from our audience today. You know, has your relationship to nature changed in the last year? Do you have new rituals? Do you think about it in a different way? Do you think about it differently for your mental health?
Yeah. All right. Thank you. You know, what you said, I think relates a little bit to what you talk about in the book, where you talk about the dose curve. You talk about the benefits of having nearby nature, and then compared to the benefits of immersion in a wilder place or a more natural place for a more extended period of time. Can you talk a little bit about what the findings of the science was, and your own observations?
Sure. People are always really interested in the dose question, and I have a slide here that I can share that talks about that. This is the concept of the nature pyramid, and it's really an idea that was popularized by the University of Virginia sort of planning department, Tim Beatley and his colleagues there. And, you know, the idea is that, you know, here at the tippy top of the pyramid, and by the way, there are sort of benefits, health benefits all along the way, but at the tippy top of the pyramid, that's where we may go for wilderness. You know, when we do get to Yosemite, or a beautiful sort of nature area where we can really spend some time and work on kind of our concept of ourselves, maybe we can grapple with some big questions about grief or trauma or identity or transitions in our lives that so many cultures, right, have tapped into across time. And then kind of in the middle of the pyramid are these, excursions that we can make, sort of on a half day or a weekend basis. And there's a lot of science there too, especially from places like Finland, countries like Finland, and the UK actually, that have really tried to look at what makes their population happier and healthier. And in Finland, health experts have come up with this recommendation that's very specific. And they say people really need a minimum dose of 5 hours a week, or no, sorry, 5 hours a month. It doesn't seem to me like it's that much, 5 hours a month in a nature area. And that's, again, sort of broadly defined. And that will actually help prevent mild depression. So if you can get 5 hours a month, and that translates to a couple times a week, 30 or 40 minutes each time. But in the UK, they ran a similar study in 2019. And if you live in the UK, you're miserable enough that you need a little more nature. So the people in the UK to have sort of optimum health and happiness, and this was, by the way, looking at, a very, very large sample size. I think they looked at like over 1 million people, health records, that it ended up being 2 hours a week. So 8 hours a month if you're from the UK. That was during Brexit, maybe that's why. And then, but really the base of the pyramid here, sort of bread and butter, if you will, is our nearby nature. So this is where most of us live. We live in cities. More than half of us around the world live in urban areas. This is where our street trees make a difference in our health outcomes, including overall mortality rates. Our green schoolyards make a difference for how stressed out kids feel and what their test scores are. There's data on views out of a window even. So, and sort of microdosing nature even contributing to people's being able to mediate stress levels. In Japan, where I went for Outside Magazine, the physiologists who were studying human subjects there, I think they had about 600 subjects over a number of months, found that just 15 minutes of spending time in a natural area, if they were really engaging all their senses, so that was sort of a shortcut, dropped their cortisol levels, which is stress hormone marker, were able to lower their blood pressure, were able to sort of regulate their heart rate variability in a way that was less stressful. So I will see if I can pop out of this slide. Stop share. There we go.
There you go.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So, I mean, to me, that was an interesting way to look at it, that there are health benefits along the dose curve, and kind of the higher you get, maybe the more benefits, but even just having a house plant like that one has been associated with sort of like micro stress regulation.
Yeah. One of the things I was struck by in terms of the research done by the neuroscientists is that when you're talking about the effects of nature on the brain, the effects of nature on the brain come through the senses, which makes sense. But when they start talking about, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about those positive effects through the senses, like through the sense of smell, and through the sense of hearing, which you describe as absolutely essential to our survival, and sight. And not all of nature has positive effects. There are certain things in nature that have those effects. If you could talk about that a bit.
Sure. Because you mentioned some negative things, I'll just talk about birdsong for a minute. Overall, birdsong is one of kind of the three happy sounds that we tend to hear in nature. It's kind of the sounds of gentle wind, water, and birdsong. Those are the most strongly correlated with a sense of well-being. sort of vitality and relaxation. But it's really only true if it's sort of pretty birdsong, like, happy tweets. If you hear, a grackle or sometimes those red-winged blackbirds, I mean, there's sort of grating, more mechanical bird songs that don't necessarily elicit those same responses. But I think, overall with the senses, it makes sense. And I think the science is really closely tied to what we see with mindfulness and research around that if we can sort of pull ourselves out of our ruminative thinking brains, and sort of dial up our sensory brains, that is overall associated with feeling more connected to the things around us, to rumination, sort of that recycling of negative thoughts, that's closely linked to depression. If we can sort of pull ourselves out of the soundtracks of our own minds and into the soundtracks of the world around us, that's really wonderful for mental health. And it turns out a lot of us just actually don't do it as often as we think. Even when we go outside in nature, many of us are on the phone, or we're listening to something, in our earbuds, or we're really thinking about our to-do list. So it actually takes a little bit of effort. And I've had to learn how to do this, where I cue myself and I say, okay, what are the birds around today? Are they different from the birds I heard last week? Am I seeing some interesting fractal patterns, in the trees or in the creek? Does the sound of the creek change in pitch as I move along the trail? So I deliberately do that now, and that's just, science has just shown that it's really a shortcut to some emotional restoration.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I tried to look more to the side rather than just where I'm walking, just to pick up. And there's something in Santa Barbara trails, I've noticed we have to walk on a concrete road for about 1.5 miles before you get in. And on that 1.5 miles, people are always arguing. They're always complaining about something mundane.
I see a study here. Someone should.
Yeah, I'm going to hook them up. I'm going to put some electronics at the beginning of the trail. There was a wonderful, in the Finland, there was even a word for it. And I love the way you described it, metsanpeta, of immersion in the forest, which you described as forest bathing on acid. And the researchers who came up with that recommendation for 5 hours a month in nature. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your experience.
I'm sure I would mangle the pronunciation. I think it's like something like metsanpieto. And what it really means, the way I understand it, is being kind of lost in beauty. So the idea that you go out into nature and your brain sort of stops for a little while, and you're sort of overcome by just beauty. There's a sense that you're sort of covered with it in almost a suffocating way. But I think the point of it is that you become sort of other than yourself. So again, sort of that ego dissolution, that so many mystical traditions talk about, where there's this kind of, dissolving of the boundaries between self and other that sometimes we're lucky enough to experience in nature, and that moment of awe. There's a lot of really interesting science into sort of the experience of awe and how it makes us, in fact, feel more socially engaged with other people, more pro-social, sort of less selfish. There are interesting studies where psychologists will give subjects photographs of, for example, a butterfly or a waterfall or a whale, and then other subjects pictures of a shopping mall or a freeway, and those two conditions actually they perform really differently for the people who look at beauty. Behave better in teams. They give away more money in lottery. And, of course, like religions have figured this out. When you can create these like gorgeous cathedrals and the sense of something larger than yourself, right? We tend to feel a greater sense of community.
Yeah. There's an interesting, my wife is researching for something she was writing, and she mentioned she found out that the Navajo, what they call the beauty way, which is a healing ceremony, is actually what they mean by beauty is coherence.
Hmm.
And what they're trying to do when they're healing someone is to bring them back into a healthy whole. But I think that connects to this sense of awe that we have when we really do get to a place where we no longer feel like we're the most significant being in the landscape, and one of the rare times where we actually do feel ourselves a part of nature, that it's not just that part of that beauty is related to everything making sense, to it being a coherent whole.
Yeah, and I think we just don't access it very much in modern life the way, you know, our human brains used to, right? I don't want to sort of over romanticize life on the Pleistocene. In the Pleistocene, it was certainly very, very stressful. But every night, you know, you sat around the fire and you looked at the stars and you saw the Milky Way and you saw the moon, and, you know, you had sort of ways to recover from stress that our brains really adapted to and evolved to sort of deal with, and we just don't experience that on a daily basis the way we used to.
It kind of relates to a chapter in the book called The Backcountry Brain, in which you open with one of my favorite quotes in the book was from Gaston Bachelard, who said, "Fire begat philosophy." Relating to what you were just saying about sitting around the fire. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that experience and the work being done.
Well, I think that quote is so nice because it really speaks to how social we are and how we really derive a lot of comfort and, you know, sort of important cognition, you know, and thoughts from talking to each other and from being social and engaging our social brains. I think that's one of the things, of course, that's been so challenging about this year, is that we're missing the comforts of sort of communicating with our kin and our community sort of beyond our closest contacts, and what that means for our brains. You know, our mirror neurons are not working the way they used to, you know, and so on. Yeah, I think that, again, just I'm interested in sort of, you know, what this pandemic year has meant for kind of the way that we engage, even in things like, you know, social grooming, which for humans really means, you know, conversing and laughing and dancing and drinking, you know, with these kinds of medium ties and weak ties that we normally have, that we've been so deprived of this year. But again, I think it's something that nature, you know, can help fulfill a little bit. I think it was, might have been Aldo Leopold who said, you know, when you're in nature, it's very hard to feel lonely. If you feel connected to those trees and to those other creatures and other living things. And of course, children, again, are sometimes a little bit better at that. And so it's so important to continue and cultivate that connection for children so that they have it the rest of their lives.
Yeah. Has it, you know, when you mentioned, has your idea of nature changed the last year with COVID and with kind of separation from being able to be in a really wild place, or observing kind of the connections between isolation and a fractured relationship to nature?
I think it has. You know, I just, in writing this book 3 and 4 years ago, I certainly started to develop more of a sense of connection to my local nature, and started to sort of figure out how to cultivate beauty, you know, where I am. But even this year, because I haven't been on the road, I haven't been traveling, I've gotten to know my local nature better. I think it's an interesting concept to think about, how helpful it is perhaps in these times to kind of adopt a wild place, a place that you can go back to and get to know. And I feel like I have, you know, really been able to enjoy that experience in a way that I hadn't before. So I've been going to the same trails. I usually go down by the Potomac River It's been amazing to just, watch the river literally change every day. The water levels, it's a tidal basin. There's a shad run, in the spring. There are different birds that come in at obviously at different times, but I had never really paid a lot of attention to that. And this year I feel like I have just developed a more intimate relationship with that local nature. And that's been really revelatory, and it's been a saving grace really for me.
Yeah.
Have you experienced that too, Vincent?
Oh, absolutely. A couple of things. One, during the lockdown, especially a year ago, when traffic considerably decreased and nobody was going to work. So the skies in California were blue I'd never seen, because I grew up with smog before the EPA, and then since then we've doubled the population. So that, and everybody wrote about this, that animals were coming out to places they hadn't, coming into the city in ways they hadn't before. But to me, even the trees looked like they were expanding. It was really a quite remarkable feeling that the suppression of human activity had actually brought out an increase in natural activity. The second point relating to yours, we go to Maine every year. And for years, we rented a cottage on a rocky ledge overlooking the ocean, which was quite dramatic and beautiful. But in the last several years, we've just stayed in a cabin on a meadow. And I found myself after a few days watching the light in the meadow, and that it never seems to settle on the grass, at the same level. And this sort of constant change that you can observe when you're looking at something small. So that's not directly related to COVID, but it is related to the sense of what that our relationship to nature is quite complex, and anything can be nature in some ways if it's not, doesn't have the human quality added to it. I wanted to ask you a little bit about, actually, just to go into question, because you do mention that we both need civilization and some experience of nature. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about that before we.
I think it was the science of awe that really had me thinking more, and this surprised me, how sort of optimizing our human impulses because of immersion in nature really helps us be better people in a community. And so, that nature is actually critical for civilization. Right. And I hadn't really thought of it that way before, but when you think about, and I'm sure we've all thought about this a lot this year too, it's the sense of responsibility we have for each other that is so important. We have to feel responsible for each other. We need to feel like we're part of a community. And there's something about being in nature that really facilitates that facilitates bonding, even large scale community bonding. This sense that, we all live under the same sky. Yeah. And you really can get a sense of that by looking at the sky. During lockdowns, I was walking out to this part of my neighborhood where you can see the sunset. And I did this like every night all summer. And a lot of my neighbors did it too. And there was this really wonderful sense of kind of shared awe and shared experience. And I think right now there are so many civilities that we are not being able to exercise. Right. People are really grumpy. They're really surly. Again, we can't see each other's facial expressions. We need every ounce of kind of civility and sense of community that we can get. And I think nature is actually this really underappreciated way to get that.
That's interesting. And that kind of connects to Aldo Leopold had a lovely line about human beings being simple citizens of the biotic community. And it may be that it's difficult to care about nature unless you also extend it to your fellow human beings. That connection is so strong. There was a wonderful chapter in the book about set in West Virginia, and Academy at SOAR, and in which an outdoor program, a summer outdoor program, had expanded to include a school in which people spent time in nature year-round. And I love the quote from the headmaster who said, we're not reinventing the wheel, we're breaking it. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about that school and
Yeah, that's
the experience of the kids.
that school, SOAR, based in North Carolina, was really founded as an alternative for kids with pretty severe attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and also kids on the autism spectrum who really weren't succeeding in conventional classrooms. And they started out doing things like woodworking and sort of a lot of hand skills, and I guess the founder really discovered that it was actually when the kids were outside that they really thrived. Traveling in the outdoors, these kids were so good at receiving multiple inputs. It's what they're really great at. And, they could literally be climbing up a rock face and able to take in information about the geology and the weather and the fact that it was about the rain and there was someone they were holding on belay. They could do multiple things at once. And in fact, their brains were so happy and high functioning in that space. And for neuro sort of atypical kids, the outdoors can really be literally a lifesaver. It made me sad that so many kids don't have that experience and can't benefit from that. This is a boarding school, is very expensive. What we do is our institutional sort of educational systems puts all these kids in a room with four walls and makes them sit down at a desk from a very young age and hold a pencil a certain way and do a certain thing with that pencil. And that is just not the way many brains work. And so that school was like, we're just going to throw that out and we're going to start over and we're going to just watch these kids thrive. And it was really, really, for me, very inspiring to see it.
Yeah. All right. And I think before, I had one more question I wanted to ask before we go into questions from the audience, or maybe first to go into the questions you have for people who are watching and listening. And it relates back to this question of civilization and nature, and you were attracted to and also or interested in the kind of biophilic design of Singapore, which is a city-state that has, because it has no land, I mean, it has actually created land for itself with landfill in the harbor. It's decreed 80% of its citizens now live within 400 meters of a green space, but it's complicated what the actual effects are. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your travel there.
Yeah, I was interested to go to Singapore because I felt like it was kind of a city of the future. It was our future. It's a very, very dense city, high population. And yet there is a love for nature there and a desire to incorporate nature into daily life. So, I think in this country, we have these incredible disparities, right, between where poor people live and where wealthy people live. And that translates partly into health disparities. We know that the environment matters. And what was so interesting about Singapore is that you saw these sort of beautiful green gardens and green designs and playgrounds and connectors, landscaped parks in all parts of the city. It wasn't just kind of in the fancy tourist hotels. There's actually a directive there that says if you want to build a building in Singapore, you have to more than replace the green space that you take up. So that's why you see these rooftop gardens and you see internal courtyards and you see these like wonderful hanging gardens on the sides of the building. And yet it is complicated because at least traditionally, a lot of that nature was sort of planted as a monocrop. There were sort of the same tree was planted, in many, many places. That's no longer the case. There's actually a great sort of biodiversity initiative happening there. But there is a very highly developed waterfront area in downtown Singapore that has these kind of electric trees And it's definitely technology meets nature, and the experience of it feels a little bit Disneyfied still to some extent. It's sort of commercialized nature. So it is complicated. It is complicated.
Yeah. I think you mentioned that had the sights of nature, but not the sounds. And yeah.
Yes, it was nice to lie under those electric trees, but I wasn't hearing. I wasn't hearing all the birds flying. I was open.
Were they sun lamps? Were they?
And there was even pulsing rock music.
Yeah. Oh gosh. All right. I guess you had a question you wanted to put to folks, and which I think this would be a great time to start before we start taking questions from the folks online.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to hear if people want to put in the chat, some of their personal experiences this year, how their relationships to nature have changed. I'd love to know if you have rituals that you've developed, if you have rediscovered or discovered anything about how nature helps you with mental health. Any new insights that have come up one way or another about that, and if you have kids, whether you've noticed anything about their being outside more this year that has sort of helped their mental health too.
All right. And that was, I think Heather made a note if you could put your answers in the chat. But we'll just, we can pause for a moment while give people time to.
Or if people have other questions for me too, I'd be happy to answer them.
Yeah. And let's see what we've got in the Q&A. So here's one question. Robert Clay writes, I really like the term nearby nature, but wonder what your thoughts are on equity and access to nature, either nearby within urban areas or equity and access to the deeper, wilder, more remote natural spaces. And before you answer, I'll just make a quick anecdote. A friend of mine ran a garment workers union daycare. That's how a long time ago that there would be a garment workers union in Chicago. And she took the kids to Lake Michigan, and when they saw it, they clapped. They had never seen the lake before. They spontaneously clapped on the bus. So,
I spent time with a Girl Scout troop in Colorado, and actually it wasn't a troop, it was a Girl Scout camp. So lots of different troops from Denver. And there was this really incredible night where we could see the Milky Way very clearly. And a lot of those girls, the middle school girls, they had never seen the Milky Way before. And they were really, really knocked out by it, of course. It was lovely to see. I am really concerned about the inequities in terms of who has access to nature and who doesn't. I think this is actually a much bigger deal than we have kind of recognized in terms of being able to manage stress among urban populations. I think the public health community in general has sort of under-recognized the role that nature can and should play in all of our lives. And I'm happy to see there actually is a fair amount of discussion and momentum sort of moving in that direction. I think that we're not going to really create a lot of change in this until we have our institutions take this on. So it's not just up to families to sort of get their kids into the parks. I think we need to really think about how we design our cities, how we design our parks. Right now, neighborhoods that are predominantly people of color have parks that are half the size of neighborhoods that are predominantly white. And of course, there are many more people per park. 100 million Americans do not live within a 10-minute walk of a park. It's about half the country. And we need greener schoolyards. Kids are, the amazing thing is that schools are actually decreasing time for recess all the time. And, really we should be doing the opposite of that, as well as incorporating just free play, but also nature education, being able to grow things. This is really, it's great for kids' mental health. It's great for their test scores. And then we also need to be thinking about our healthcare institutions. So increasingly, I think right now there are about 73 clinics in the country that are prescribing time in parks to their patients, especially to pediatric patients, because we see these chronic conditions that are so hard to treat otherwise, obesity, anxiety, depression, diabetes, and outdoor play has really been helpful for some of those. So slowly, I think there's some change.
One thing I'd like to add to that, I think in cities where that have some space that it has opened up because they have abandoned buildings or abandoned owners, there are wonderful little community parks popping up here and there. One in the Bronx. It's a garden, where people create a community garden across a tenth of an acre that also becomes in a way a community center. A lot of volunteers come to work and people come to hang out. And I think that's one way to build from the bottom up, rather than we very much need the top down, but people in communities can also make changes.
Absolutely.
We have a certified forest therapy guide from Honolulu who, and she says the participants on her forest bathing walks find fascinating is why we're so attuned to the sound of water or birds or the color green. And can you speak some to the theory of biophilia and human evolution as to why that's so?
Sure. Yale professor Steve Keller, of course, talked a lot about biophilia. The concept was really popularized by E.O. Wilson, Harvard entomologist, and it's really this, just idea that as human beings we evolved in natural settings. We've spent, 99.9% of our evolution there, and so our brain systems, our perceptual systems, are really adapted to interpret information from the natural world. There's this sort of wonderful affiliation we have for living things because we know our survival depends on them, but also just in a very sort of neurological sense, our bodies and our brains become kind of comfortable when we're in nature spaces because we know how to interpret those spaces, we know how to read them, as opposed to sort of the traffic circles of Washington, D.C., where I found myself when I first moved here, completely overwhelmed by that environment. I would burst into tears. We have to filter out so much stimulation from modern life. It actually is very taxing on our brains. It uses up a lot of sort of brain glycogen to filter out these noises and crazy things going on around us. Whereas when we're in a nature space, we can actually really kind of relax and open up our senses. We know how to do that. We know how to look at a tree. And so on just a very subconscious level, we kind of psychologically feel at home. So it's an interesting concept.
Which doesn't come from immersion in DuPont Circle.
Maybe it does eventually, but not for a while.
Right. Thank you, Phyllis, for that question. And then Naomi asked, what recent research about nature and human health are you particularly excited about?
What am I most excited about now? Okay, what I'm really excited about now are things like grief and trauma, because we are all undergoing this. We're undergoing it collectively. We're undergoing it individually. I think there's some really interesting work there. And I think that nature will prove to be very, very helpful and comforting to people with big mental health issues, as well as people who are just dealing with like the daily stresses of urban life.
Yeah, thank you. And here's one from Raymond Hinchcliffe. Do you plan to research, the nature connection with animals, dogs, cats, and other pets?
I'm very fond of that idea. There are a lot of other, I think, good journalists out there who are looking at that. Alexandra Horowitz has written some really great stuff about relationships with dogs and deep connections. I know many of us have new pets this year, and that has been tremendously beneficial. from a mental health perspective. And there's something about kids too. It's really, really helpful for kids to sort of feel like you have an ally in your pet. So I'm a huge fan of it. I think I'm going to leave it to some other journalists though to really unpack it.
All right. I have on my walk home, I formed a relationship with a cat named Toby, who's one of the few cats who comes running at you because he wants to get petted. And
my cat is named Toby.
He has it on his collar. He's a very large cat who should be named Brutus or something like that. But
I must think he's a dog.
He's and he runs for me to get his ears scratched. And what I'd like to do is just a couple more questions and then maybe go to your question. So from Philip Hosmer, the paradox of the pandemic is that it's caused more people to go outside. And it consequently makes it more difficult to access solitude and quiet, and wonders if as the pandemic recedes, will people go back to their previous indoor dominated lifestyles, or will we see a lasting change in human relationship to nature?
Yeah, that is the $1 million question, right? I am very curious about that one too. You know, I'm not as concerned about more people being outside in nature. That actually really makes my heart sing. I'm really glad more people are out in nature. I get it that sometimes that is a little inconvenient for those of us who seek solitude. But you know what? Today I walked in a city park in Washington. It was 39 degrees out and it was raining. And I was the only person. I saw one other in an hour. I saw one other person. So I think that we need to adjust. Maybe if solitude is important to us, we need to sort of adjust maybe how we do it. Go at odder hours and in worse weather. There is nothing wrong with going outside when it's raining and cold. In fact, it's really a great time to be out there. So. And
also go a quarter of a mile farther than where everybody else is going. Here's an interesting question from Sharon Silberman. How can we use this research to address climate change, and especially overconsumption behaviors that drive so much of the underlying cause of climate change?
A couple of things. One is that I feel like if we can forge a deeper connection to the natural world, we will care about it more. And actually research has shown that there's a greater degree of nature connectedness linked to environmental and conservation attitudes. The other is this concept I've talked about being pro-social, you know, working together. These climate change, you know, it's going to demand solutions that take us outside, right, of our personal needs and our personal wants and our personal conveniences. We're going to have to think about the public good. And so anything we can do that helps us feel like we are part of the solution and we are part of the problem and we're in it together, I think can only be helpful.
Yeah, I would echo that from everything that we've seen. And let's see more, and I just we'll switch to the chat room here. Oh, this is from Maggie Favretti. I'm curious about whether Florence visited with indigenous peoples, also people recovering from a significant natural disaster, such as in Puerto Rico.
Yeah, I did actually, not for the Nature Fix, but for a book I'm currently working on. I visited Joplin, Missouri, which recovered from an EF5 devastating tornado in 2011. It killed 124 people and demolished 4,000 structures and took out something like 10,000 trees. And one of the ways that community has tried to recover is by building a butterfly garden. And they've planted butterfly friendly shrubs. It's on the site of where there was a devastating loss of life and infrastructure in a park in Joplin. There are spaces for reflection and there are places to write in a journal. There's some really beautiful interpretation. And it really got me thinking of the idea of, since we talked about biophilia, the idea of urgent biophilia, which I think is really interesting. And it's this idea that sometimes when we are in need of resilience and when we're recovering from deep crisis, nature is actually one of the first places we seek some solace. And as we talk about things like stockpiling ventilators and stockpiling surgical masks, I think we also need to be thinking about stockpiling nature. We need bigger parks, we need better parks, we need places where we can go to really recover again from these collective disasters. And as to the indigenous populations, I did not spend time with indigenous populations for this book. I think there's a lot to learn from how other communities interact with nature and what their relationships are, and I'm very open to that.
All right, thank you. Right. Urgent biophilia is a very cogent phrase.
Yeah, it's interesting, right?
Yeah. We had a lot of questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them. I'd like to get to at least one or two comments on the chat before we close. And throughout the pandemic, I've noticed so many more people recreating and enjoying local natural places. I'm hoping this has enhanced their appreciation of the value of these types of places, and hope they can continue to go when things are back to normal, quote unquote. And here's daily walks in the neighborhood into a cemetery which offers excellent view of Hanging Cliffs of Meriden. Lots of bird song recently, and just yesterday saw 6 lovely ducks. And I think that's about it. So I'm going to go back and thank you for those. I'd like to just go back to one more question. So from Judith Wood, I loved the book Blue Mind and was interested that even a photo of water in the home or office delivered real benefits. And maybe that's the parallel. The parallels the idea of houseplants or pets. But what about just having photos of nature around us? Is there evidence that we can get help when we can't actually get outdoors?
Sorry, was the question about photos? Is that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not opposed to people bringing their phones into nature. I'm not a purist about that. I think there are times to put it away for sure. If it helps you to see beauty, to think about framing a photograph for Instagram or for yourself, then I support it. I think we all need to cultivate our sense of finding beauty. And sometimes technology can actually really help us do that. And then it's neat to share it, with other people too. I know a lot of people have experienced awe in, watching videos of, for example, those, bird murmurations. We've seen these amazing videos on social media, and they can be really moving and powerful.
All right. Well, I just wanted to close with, you called it a coda, and others might call it a mantra in the book, kind of comparable to what Michael Pollan came up with for food. And I think for those who were part of the talk with Judy Samuelson, she had one for behavior in business. And yours, I think, is a great way for us to go out of the hour, and that is go outside often. Sometimes to wild places, bring friends or not, and breathe. With that, I want to thank you, Florence, so much for your work, for writing the book, and for your time today. And thanks to everybody who was here and engaged in the conversation and the questions it raised. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much for having me, and go outside, everyone.